I continue to read the biography of Isaiah Berlin, A Life, by Michael Ignatieff. Chapter 11, Leningrad, 1945. He heard that Leningrad's bookstores might have a richer store of pre-revolutionary material than that on sale to foreigners in Moscow. So it was books, not nostalgia, that lured Berlin to the city of his childhood. On 12 November, he set off on the Red Arrow overnight sleeper in company with Brenda Tripp, an organic chemist who represented the British Consul. As she confided in her diary, he was shy, avoided contact with her, and covered up his nervousness with a great deal of talk. After supper in a dining car, they returned to their sleeper. He on the top bunk, reading in his pajamas, she on the bottoms. When he turned out the light, she found it amusing that he dropped all the newspapers onto the floor, like a child tossing its toys out of a pram. After checking into the Astoria Hotel, scarcely heated but still in its pre-revolutionary glory, they both sought out his old apartment on Angelevsky Prospect. He lingered outside in the snow, taking in the dank atmosphere of the inner courtyard, as sordid and abandoned as one he had last seen it in Lenin's time. He ran his hands over the familiar broken railings of the little shop in the basement, the one with the misspelled sign, Shame over, where the old tinker had repaired samovars and other domestic goods. He felt himself suspended half in the too real past, half in the unreal present. In a melancholy daze, he wandered along the naval embankment and then down Nevsky Prospect. The tramcars were full to overflowing and crowded along like gigantic disabled wasps, covered with human barnacles. People in the streets looked shabbier and more emaciated than the Muscovites. The 1000-day blockade still marked every face. His eyes sought after survivors of the city he had once known, the worn and torn members of the old intelligentsia, their threadbare clothes flapping in the piercing wind and the snow. If the survivors were in tatters, the city itself was a haunting combination of devastation and grandeur. In the year that had passed since the siege had been lifted, the worst effects of the bombardment had been repaired, but the royal palaces and resorts on the outskirts of the city, Tsarskoye Selo, Peterhof, Oranienbaum, remained in ruins, and many of the city's facades were still pitted with shell bursts and shrapnel. Behind these facades, as Joseph Brodsky was to put it, among old pianos, worn-out rugs, dusted paintings in heavy bronze frames, leftovers of furniture, consumed by the iron stoves during the siege, a faint life was beginning to glimmer. At the top of the Nevsky, a day after his arrival, Berlin and Brenda Tripp came upon the writer's bookshop. Behind the counter of the after room were shelves lined with pre-revolutionary books at prices considerably cheaper than in Moscow. There was also an inner room behind a curtain, which writers and critics used as a kind of club, going in there to get off the cold, to browse and gossip. The manager of the shop was a small, thin, gay-bodied, red-haired Jew named Gennady Masaryevich Raklin, who invited them into the inner sanctum. Raklin proudly informed Berlin that his bookshop was on the very site of Smerdin's famous establishment, once frequented by Belinsky and the Russian writers of the 1830s and 1840s. Figures in tattered coats were leafing through the old volumes and gossiping quietly among themselves. Russian literary life, Isaiah could see, was still indomitably alive. Raklin was a kind of a Leningrad Viagra, dictator of the city's book prices, chief purveyor of literature to the city's writers, indefatigable go-between, gossip, scold, and club manager. He also arranged the theater tickets, lectures, and contact with foreigners. He boasted of his roster of important clients: Molotov, the foreign minister; Beria, the head of the secret police, not to mention the patriarch Alexis and the Leningrad rabbi. Raklin had plans to open a shop in Moscow and seemed to believe that these various authorities would support him. Isaiah struck up a conversation with one of the figures browsing in the back room. He turned out to be the critic and historian Vladimir Orlov. The siege, he told Isaiah, had been unimaginable. Virtually all of the children born during those 3 years had died. Raklin described how bodies lay in the streets, since it was impossible to bury them in the frozen ground. Into this very shop, he said, figures half dead with cold and hunger had come clutching chapters ripped from old books, hoping to exchange them for food. Raklin and Orlov had both been kept alive by special rations issued to intellectuals. Raklin joked that for rationing purposes, he had been classed as a second-rate writer. He could still taste the carpenter's glue that he had diluted with water and drunk as soup. More than a year after the lifting of the siege, some Leningraders were still giddy from undernourishment. Had it not been for Comrade Zhdanov's convoys across frozen Lake Leningrad in 1943, they would have perished. Yes, Raklin insisted. It had been Comrade Zhdanov who had saved the city. Berlin asked about the fate of the city's writers. He mentioned two names: Mikhail Zhashchenko, whose modern and melancholy satire, scenes from the bathhouse, had made him one of the most popular Soviet writers of the 1920s, and Anna Akhmatova, a poet of the pre-revolutionary era, who had not been allowed to publish anything since 1925. The regime had silenced them both, but still considered them national treasures. When the Germans surrounded Leningrad in the autumn of 1941, Zhdanov had ordered them to be flown over the German lines to Moscow and from there to Tashkent, where they spent the war. Zhashchenko, it so happened, was now in a bookshop, slumped in a chair, yellow of complexion, withdrawn, incoherent, pale, weak, and emaciated. Isaiah shook his hand but did not have the heart to engage him in conversation. Isaiah had read John Shenko's Scenes from the Bathhouse, but as for Ashimatova's poetry, he had read nothing at all. She was just a fabled name from the vanished Tsarist past, known to him because Marisa Bauer had translated some of her early poems and had included them in his wartime collection of Russian verse. Bauer did not even know whether she was still alive, so Isaiah asked, in all innocence, whether she was, and the critic Orlov replied, to his astonishment, "Why, yes, of course. She lives not far from here on the Fontanka in Fontany Dome. Would you like to meet her?" It was, Isaiah remembered, as if he had been invited to meet Christina Rossetti or some semi-mythological figure from the history of literature. In his excitement, he could only stammer that he would indeed like to meet her. There and then Olive made a phone call and returned to say that the poet would receive them that very afternoon at 3 o'clock. Isaiah returned Brenda trip to the Astoria and walked back to the bookshop. In company with Orlov, he set off across the Anichkov Bridge with its statues of rearing bronze horses along the Fotanka Canal on a snowy gray afternoon in failing light. Fontany Dome was the 18th century palace of the Sheremetev family. Its baroque yellow and white plasterwork was pitted with shell fragments and in places worn away by neglect. They passed beneath the Sheremetev crest over the baroque entrance, through rococo iron gates and into the interior courtyard. Berlin and Orlov went up a dark, steep staircase to a third-floor apartment, number 44, past 5 or 6 rooms ranged along the corridor. Most of the apartment was occupied by Archimatova's ex-husband, Nikolai Putin, his wife and a child. Archimatova herself had a room looking over the courtyard at the end of the hall. It was bare and denuded. No carpets on the floor or curtains at the windows, just a small table, 3 chairs, a wooden chest, a sofa, and near the bed a drawing of Archimatova, head bent, reclining on a couch, rapidly sketched by her friend Amandio Modigliani during her visit to Paris in 1911. It was the only icon of Europe she had last seen 34 years before. No, stately, gray-haired, with a white shawl around her shoulders, she rose to greet her first visitor from that lost continent. Isaiah bowed. It seems appropriate, for she looked like a tragic queen. She was 20 years older than he, once a famous beauty, now shabbily dressed, heavy, with shadows beneath her dark eyes, but of a proud carriage and a cooling, dignified expression as they sat down on recreant chairs at opposite ends of the room and began talking. Isaiah knew her only as the brilliant and beautiful member of the pre-revolutionary poetic circle known as the Academicists, as the brightest star of St. Petersburg's wartime avant-garde and its meeting place, the Street Dog Cafe, but of what had befallen her after the revolution, he knew nothing. There was nothing falsely melodramatic about her tragic air. Her first husband, Nikolai Gamalayev, had been executed in 1921 on trumped-up charges of plotting against Lenin. The years of terror had begun for her then and not in 1937. Although she wrote continuously, she was not allowed to publish a line of her poetry between 1925 and 1940. During that time, she had survived by working in the library of an agricultural institute, by translating and writing critical studies of Pushkin and Western writers like Benjamin Constant. As all contact with the outside world was severed, Akhmatova and her fellow poet Osip Mandelstam kept alive a fierce conviction that the tyranny that had divided them from Paris, London, and Berlin would not endure forever. As Mandelstam wrote in 1933 in his poem Aristotle, quote, "It's cold in Europe, Italy is dark, and the power is barbarous like the hands of Peter the Great. Oh, to throw wide open, as soon as possible, a vast window on the Adriatic. Dear Aristotle, maybe a century shall pass, and we shall pour your azure and our black together into one fraternal, vast, blue-black sea. We were there too. We too drank mead." End quote. Akhmatova had been there on the night in 1934 when Mandelstam was taken away for his first interrogation, and from then until his death in Magadan, she stood by his wife, Nadezhda. But in March 1938, the weight of the terror fell upon her directly. Her son, Lev Gumilayev, was arrested. For 17 months, she had no idea whether he was alive or dead. As terror sealed the lips of those around her, she made herself the poet of despair and abandonment. Quote, "For 17 months I have been crying out, calling you home. I have flung myself at the hangman's feet. You are my sun and my horror. Everything is confused forever. And it is not clear to me who is the beast now, who is the man. How long before the execution?" End quote. For 17 months, she stood in the queues of women outside the Kresty prison in Leningrad, vainly seeking news. It was in these queues that she received what she always regarded as an imperative summons to an act of poetic witness. Quote, "Then a woman with bluish lips standing behind me, who, of course, had never heard me called by name, woke up from the stupor to which everyone had stumbled and whispered in my ear, 'Can you describe this?' And I answered, 'Yes, I can.' Then something that looked like a smile passed over what once had been her face." End quote. Akhmatova's poetic circle, Requiem, kept her promise to that anonymous woman. It preserved in poetic memory the torments of a generation. In those days, it was too dangerous to keep these poems in written form. Akhmatova's friend, the novelist Lydia Tchaikovskaya, remembered the bitter ceremony that used to conclude Akhmatova's whispered reading of these poems. How, when finished, she would hold the pages over the ashtray and silently burned them to ash. During her wartime evacuation to Tashkent between 1941 and 1944, Akhmatova lived in an airless top-floor room in the hostel for Moscow writers Lydia Tchaikovskaya and Nadezhda Mandelstam lived there too, and for a time their conditions were eased. Akhmatova was allowed to publish a severely censored volume of selected poems and gave readings in hospitals for wounded soldiers. In May 1944, she was at last allowed to leave Tashkent. On her way home, she stopped in Moscow and gave a reading at the Polytechnic Museum, which ended with the audience rising and applauding her as a national figure, the incarnation of the victorious Russian language. She herself was terrified by this mask of respect and feared the attention it brought. She was right to do so, for as Pasternak reported to her, Stalin himself supposedly asked Zamenhof, who organized this standing ovation. Akhmatova's return to Leningrad in June 1944 proved to be desolate. The city was a horrible specter. So many of her friends were dead. Her rooms in the Fontana Dome had been looted and smashed. She had hopes of being reunited with Viktor Gushyn, a Leningrad coroner with whom she had become close after leaving Punin. He met her at the station and told her that he had decided to marry someone else. So, as she was meeting Isaiah, she was just coming to terms at the age of 56 with the prospect of living the rest of her life alone. In the late summer of 1945, her son Lev, released earlier from Siberia to serve in the Soviet army in Germany, at last returned home. She allowed herself to hope that her life might finally be about to improve. Certainly, without the fact of Lev's recent release and thus the liberation of the hostage, whose fate might have inclined her to caution, it is doubtful that she would have taken the risk of seeking a temporary first secretary from the British embassy in Moscow. Vladimir Orlov and an academic lady friend of Akhmatova's were with them as they talked, and the conversation at first was formal and constrained. Berlin said he was glad to see her in good health, since nothing had been heard of her for many years. She corrected him regularly. An article about her had appeared in the Dublin Review, and a thesis was being written about her work, so she had been told in Blagona. She might have been wondering at this point how much of her work Isaiah had actually read, and he was certainly apprehensive that she would release he had read nothing. She would realize she had read nothing. Then she asked him how London had survived the war. He replied as best he could, unaware that she had written to the Londoner in 1940. In the poem, she had expressed her horror at the thought of London being destroyed, but also her unshakable belief in the unity of a European culture, of which the nervous young British officials sitting before her now was the unwitting symbol. Quote, "Time with an impassive hand is writing the 24th drama of Shakespeare. We, the celebrants at this terrible feast, would rather read Hamlet, Caesar, or Lear. There by the Leiden River, we would rather today, with torches and singing, be bearing the dove Julia to her grave, would rather peer in at Macbeth's windows, trembling with the hired accession. Only not this, not this, not this. This we don't have the strength to read." As they talked, Isaiah began hearing his name being shouted nearby. He thought it was an illusion until the word Isaiah echoing up from the courtyard below became too loud to ignore. He went to the window, looked down, and to his horror he saw Rudolph Churchill standing in the middle of the yard, bawling up at the window like a tipsy undergraduate in a quad at Christ Church. Berlin muttered an apology and fled, followed by Orlov. In the courtyard, Isaiah introduced the Soviet critic to the son of Mr. Winston Churchill. No sooner had he shaken hands than Orlov fled. Now any chance of the meeting with Akhmatova passing unnoticed had been thrown away. Indeed, absurd rumors immediately began to circulate that Churchill was in Leningrad to reconnoiter a British rescue operation that would whisk Akhmatova to England. In fact, Churchill simply wanted Isaiah, whom he had known as an undergraduate, to return to the Astoria and explain to the hotel staff that the cavalry he had just purchased should be placed on ice. Isaiah gritted his teeth, returned to the Astoria, safely united Churchill's cavalry with the requisite ice, and then telephoned Akhmatova to apologize and arrange another meeting. "I shall wait for you at 9 this evening," came her reply. There was a soaring innocence in her decision. Only a queen could have been so oblivious to the risk she was taking. We know that she keenly awaited his return. Afterwards, she dedicated some lines of a poem to those feelings of keen anticipation. Quote, "But how gladly I heard his step on the stair, his touch on the bell, as shy as a boy's fingertip touching his first girl." But when she opened the door to him, she was not alone. Another learned lady, an expert in Assyrian antiquities, was there and asked Berlin questions about the English universities, while Akhmatova sat silent, keeping to herself. It was midnight before they were at last alone. The room was poorly light. She sat in one corner, he in the other, smoking Swiss miniature cigars with their plastic handles. Her face was wreathed in the shadow, his in smoke. She immediately began asking him about her Russian friends in immigration. He was able to tell her that she had met the composer Arthur Louis in New York during the war. She had had a brief affair with Laurie in the far-gone era when she had frequented the Stray Dog Cafe and he had composed futuristic music for performance there. She asked after Boris Arab. Isaiah told her that he was at work as an artist in London. It must have seemed uncanny that this complete stranger should have known these old friends and proved able to restore the connection broken by revolution. It is easy to imagine her delight when Isaiah told her that he also knew Solomaya Andronikova Hapon, a Petersburg beauty of the street dog era, with whom Mandelstam had been briefly in love, and whom the whole alchemist circle had admired both for her beauty and for her capacity to listen and inspire. Isaiah told her that she had married a Russian lawyer, Alexander Hapern, and that they were living in New York. As Akhmotova later recorded, this young stranger had miraculously brought me Solomon back from the dim pharaonic vault of the street dog cabaret. In her eyes, Isaiah was serving as a messenger between the two Russian cultures, one in external exile, the other in internal exile, which had been split apart by the revolution.